part of the slave state, and the debate is part of the slave state. You've already conceded that we are participating within it. Our argues that we have to find strategies within debate to disrupt the slave state. Debates complicit within these structures of various oppression that take the resolutions as mere reflection of the fate of the community's alliance with anti-black society. We have to be able to resist the structures that we are in, and we are establishing competition because our mechanism is universal negation. Only our irrational universal negation has the politically relevant potential to disrupt the collegial atmosphere, disrupt the stable fabric of debates, political economy, and structures of exchange. How our call for universal negation, which would destroy debate, as you know, because of the wrench to how debate and the world maintains itself, i.e., CSIS will be able to recruit debaters for think tanks anymore because it's impossible for essentially the affirmation around status quo, imperial national judgment reverse also applies. Negative teams will be able to run diss ads and counterplans that compete to protect the genocidal slave state. The whole manner in which America looks for its best intellectual defenders will be thrown into crisis within the confines of debate. Universal negation face the instability that destroys the ability for debate to function as a conservator of imperial national. Now they make all the arguments that Europe valve within the genres not affect all the vows outside the But again, you should be highly skeptical of these type of arguments, especially when even their evidence, especially their ONO2 evidence that they're reading on the K-Flow says that their type of act is a constant revolt against sovereignty, which means that our arguments that our political strategy of constantly revolting against debate is something that has some efficacy, and that even if you do not vote negative every single round, it's about this battle and what your battle signifies within this specific round. Then these arguments about building coalition, but again, this argument, you should be highly skeptical of this card itself. You should read it because this argument assumes that there's a negotiation between subjects, that subjects can come to coalitions. But our whole argument on the bullshit flow is saying that the black body and the black body of the slave is never a human subject, but it's always the fetish object is always being accumulated by white flesh, which means that all this argument about coalition building don't take into context the fact that the slave cannot negotiate on the playing field of subjectivity itself. Additionally, the last part of the evidence talks about how we used to have a multiplicity of things, but again, this multiplicity of things only creates a view from nowhere. This is Yancey and 5. The embodied cell was bracketed and deemed irrelevant to the theory. Superflow is cumbersome. This is best for the reason of nowhere. It had to white phosphor also presumed to speak for all of us. So the slight mention of his or her race identity of my own devices. This appears from author. The whiteness of my authorship. The whiteness for authorship is a form of authority. To speak apparently from nowhere for everyone is empowering. Such an authorship of authority is also touchable. It gives the pleasure of self-forgetting and the transcendence of mundane, particular pleasure of the power of comprehension. The great pursuit is also just disavow the fact that some bodies cannot be cannot occur within the space of multiplicity. Some people's are ontologically marked by the skin color. I can't just switch my skin color to be white. I can't just affirm multiplicity. It doesn't make sense for people who, who aren't fluid identified. You get to play with ritual blood sacrifice because it's just a game to you. That's a view from nowhere. That's an argument on the game. Your argument that you should sacrifice the battle in favor of the structured civil society, which is very part of the program of complete sword. That's our vote stem. Even we don't even have to win the universal negation flow. Rather, our vote stems goes whole conceit talking about how centrally black is within our scholarship is necessarily key because blackness and black studies itself is inexorable of something that civil society cannot comprehend because the black object is always outside of the bounds of human subjectivity that he said that totally outside of the cartography of what we understand as humanity, which is with the argument of complete sort of there, accumulating gods can never problematize their own energy within the big face-to-face ask yourself, what the hell has the humanity accomplished besides mental masturbation? Quite literally, what do you mean? This used to be highly skeptical of all their arguments that say that all their arguments talk about a universal human experience, or even their tags and the way they see to talk about our existence. I know you're definitely not talking about the anti-human figure, the slave, which whose energy is constantly being siphoned off by the prison industrial complex. This absolutely disavows that black objects are constantly being used fungibly and accumulated in prison cells because cops have a fetish to lock up young black flesh and hold black flesh captive, even if they win. That sacrifice is good. You should be skeptical. Good for who? Who will be sacrificed post-plan? Their evidence only talks about accumulating the power of the sun, but never interrogates how the black is accumulating stockpiles to soothe white anxiety. There's scholarship papers over how black flesh is a fetish object of humanity and subjectivity writ large, and humanity has a repetition compulsion to inflict this violence from post-plan. Is the black body is always vulnerable. Bullshit said bonds of middle class and slave state technology, the accumulation of fungibility, recompose, reenact the horrors of each succeeding generation's black responsible to gratuitous, not considered transgressions against hegemony in civil society and structural positioning blacks to allow to be outside the main civil society. Simultaneously renders untouched tasks of humanity like itself wholly dependent on civil society's repetition, compulsion, frenzy, and fragmented machinations through which civil society reenacts gratuitous violence on the black, and civil society by itself being in the domains of human generation after generation, generation after generation. Now, they reach urban evidence, but again, this evidence says this evidence says that the resistance can only be done discursively, not through a proposition, which means that you should make them choose about whether it's about the speech act of the 1AC or it's about the specific policy proposal that they have we should have. Additionally, again, this evidence says that we should constantly revolt, which means that there is more solvency there's more solvency for our alternative. Now they say that, and additionally, look at this evidence. This evidence is talking about interrogating the underside of the human experience. Well, what is the human experience, and who are you talking about? The point in which they're dropping our woods of books. It means that this type of universalization is always problematic because it always looks at humanity something redeemable, something that we can save, that reaches out the underside of human experience, but never looks at how there are certain bodies that are never considered human in the first place. They talk about how Bataille breaks down subjectivity, but again, even Bataille just says the heart of modernity, the subject and object. But what is the subject and what is the object? Only our arguments, only our theorization of anti-blackness writ large says that humanity is the subject and the constant object. The way in which humanity reaffirms itself and knows itself and the domain of humanity is by the constant enslavement of the black, constant enslavement back and repetition, compulsion down. What we're talking about, and our argument is that it's not just about white people, but it's rather about humanity at large, because even Arabs traded slaves. So our argument is that, even Arabs traded slaves. The first multicultural project of the world was to enslave black people, to look at Africa as a site of absolute dereliction. So our argument is that we have to interrogate human subjectivity writ large, not just some form of subjectivity, some form of accumulation.
Okay, so first let's talk about universal negation. Do you universally negate the ballot when you're affirmed? Okay, so why not, if you are constantly revolting?
It's about this, man.
So a constant revolt that
It's
has
about,
to always happen because of this round.
The argument I said was that it may be true that he may vote after the next round, but it's about the
I know what you said,
for this round.
My question is, if you yourselves do not universally negate when you're affirmative.
When I'm neg, I always universally negate. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, right. You always universally negate when you're negative. And your argument in order to. Yes, but is not your claim on solvency that in order to destabilize the structures, the rigid structures, the traditional debate, we have to universally revolt? Yeah, a precedent that you break when you are affirmative.
I won't be mad if he judges us again and we're after he says I will neg because of universal negation.
Sure, but that argument belies the idea, right, that when you're negative, you can convince a bunch of judges to vote against you when you're affirmative, right?
Can you explain that?
You make the argument in distinction between our advocacy and yours, that we do not constantly revolt. I'm questioning how you have
I didn't say that. I didn't say that you don't constantly revolt. My argument is that your evidence says that we should. And my argument is that we are outlining a political strategy for the judge in which he can constantly do so, and it starts by setting the precedent in this round.
We constantly revolt, but it doesn't matter if you vote F other times. Debate conserves imperial non-direction was about that.
I don't know anything around here, so like I said, I clarify my argument. My argument is that even if he votes F in other rounds, argues about the political precedent.
Okay, so you've clarified that it doesn't have to be a constant revolt. Like, you don't have to revolt all the time.
Our strategy, the strategy that the 1NC has outlined is for the constant revolt.
But it doesn't matter if you don't actually constantly revolt. You said this is a debate about debate. Your debate practices in other rounds negate what you just said.
My practice is not about my practices. It's about what the judge does and about the judge universally voting negative to destroy the competition.
But your only distinction between universally voting affirmative, which also destroys competition, which was the resolution dissent.
Yes,
but my question then is, if when you're negative, since this is a performative argument, when you're negative, when you're affirmative, you affirm that resolution. I don't understand then what the distinction between universal affirmation and universal negation is.
No, I don't understand that question because we don't necessarily affirm the resolution like you may assume. and we just
Well,
lost.
I don't think we affirm the resolution like you assume either, and I'm not saying you don't ever lose in the affirmative. What I'm saying is that this distinction between universal affirmation and universal negation seems to me to become a little bit hollow if you're not universally negated.
It's about the judge doing it, not me.
See, I know you say that, but I don't understand what the distinction for the judge is.
Because the judge is the one who adjudicates and is able to destroy competition, not me.
It's going to be the case. And then the K,
What case?
the ladder. The anti-locking switch.
Their first piece of 1AC evidence says that human isolation is basically the metaphor is that there is Earth spinning in the universe. We shouldn't take this metaphor as how the world is explained. Rather, we should see blackness as the very space that allows for coherence. The Earth should be there. The Earth should be there in the first place. They would preclude any discussion of this with their focus on this human isolation that continues. They are mishandling the case arguments that there are no restrictions currently besides what civil society offers. That they are saying that we cannot kill people. There can be no blood sacrifice because of the law. This is exactly our arguments with the absolute dereliction on the anti-blackness is that they flinch in the face that they are inorgasmic. They don't decide to just do it. They don't decide to just burn every day. They say, no, we have to wait for the federal government. Even their hypothetical advocacy statement still relies on some sort of adherence to the world in which we live in as opposed to a complete disavowal or at least an acceptance of the position of disavowal, which is blackness stance. This is a mutual exclusive position. They cannot get any inroads to this. And additionally, their argument is essentially non-unique. Trayvon Martin proves that there are sacrifices. George Zimmerman did the blood sacrifice. His body was plastered all over TVs everywhere. That coheres white America. That cohered the world around it. That the black flesh necessarily was deemed as what could be the blood sacrifice. It was accepted. Also cross-apply all the 2&C analysis on the prison industrial complex. They are not winning any kind of explanation about how this sacrifice would go down, or even if it's a sacrifice, or even if it's really a sacrifice, which is all of our arguments that this unpredictable predictability argument is only fluidity that they can engage in, that the affirmative view essentially Bataille is not talking about black people. Let's keep it real here. None of their arguments talk about black people. None of their arguments talk about anti-blackness. Don't let them try to spin the case as that is exactly what white civil society does. Is it tries to suck up any contestation towards it. It tries to destroy it by that disavowal, by saying, yes, you are incorporated. We give you civil rights. We give you all of these things, which is our Farley evidence, but all that does is bow down to the face of the plantation system. Essentially, they are the care. They are sipping lemonade while the slaves are working, but still trying to talk about how slavery is bad, but not challenging the underlying system. And actions incoherent in a bad way, not even consistent with Bataille, who admits that wasteful consumption requires limits for the sake of self-preservation, equal to 99. Our wasteful consumption must have limits to improve our self-destruction. Those who are we are bound to reject something that would be in ruining and self-preservation is a fundamental value of time. There is also ample motive to resist the bond that denies the value. We must condemn what threatens to destroy us. It is when we are ignorant of these aberrations that are most vulnerable to them. When they start the 1AC with the personal pronoun we and papers over structural matrix of bonds that creates the subject in the first place, mapping over the multiplicities as enabling still existing as a part of civil society's bullshit intent. The drama of value then is underwritten by the inspiration of the personal pronoun we. The inspiration of we is a form of suture. Papers over any contemplation of violence as a structural matrix of what is the notion of violence as a contingent event, and the inspiration of we also such as field of study and political motivations as exceedingly as far apart as the great Marxism, Gramsci, and Lacanian field studies such as them together by way of two basic assumptions. One, that all people have bodies, and two, that all people contest jobs of value, thus operate like police action. They police our ability to contemplate how the slave is now a lesser valued entity on a pole of higher value entities, but instead exiled from the drama of value. There, welcome evidence is is terrible because we aren't talking of positioning our identities in contestation to whiteness, rather saying that it is a fundamental anti-blackness, that it is the object, it is the symbol in which everything else, life itself, coheres, which means that their evidence is in the context. We're also not focusing on whiteness studies. It is called Afro-pessimism for a reason. Secondly, they read this Newman evidence. You should vote them down on this evidence. Them trying to characterize that Haitians brought this onto themselves is exactly what civil society, exactly what those developed nations do. Haiti, nobody would engage with trade relations with Haiti because they were a black nation. America invaded Haiti because they saw it as being vulnerable, as being open to the violence that they could inflict with it. That's why the Haiti devastated, not because they decided to resist against slave masters. That kind of logic is exactly what means the permutation can never solve, because they can never see the potential in any radical black movements. They say the Baha'i evidence is terrible. School them in cross-sections in the context of the African diaspora, and how God's saying that in Willis's ideas don't necessarily apply. Our argument extends beyond that, is that even you being Afro-Brazilian, yes, you may have your own identity, but structurally the world still sees you as vulnerable and open to that violence. That's why in Brazil there's like bleaching techniques. That's why there's more black organizations that specifically advocate for black rights. That there is these other organizations that would deny that claim, that there's something like that. They say the Brown non-evidence, the alternative would check this back, because specifically Vincent Brown is talking about how there's no affirmation of some sort of radical potential. We're saying that the Haitian Revolution as a metaphor as to how we should think about approaching alternatives to the world, that nothing is redeemable, which means that the only thing we can do is destroy it. In addition, they try to spin and say that they read these other Brown arguments. Those are all about victimization. We aren't talking about victimization whatsoever. We're talking about how suffering is structured by a fundamental anti-blackness, that there was that violence that occurred. Also, that kind of evidence is in the context of the Rwandan genocide, and how people decided to start killing other people because they thought that they were better than others. No, people destroyed the whole idea of some sort of hierarchy, of this idea of one over brother, other white over black. Next, they read this last welcome forward card. We are talking about experiences, rather a structural position. We understand that black people experience things differently, but that doesn't mean that a cop doesn't slow by when you're walking down the street because he thinks you're suspect.